Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful workshop. The patient voice is something that we have long wanted to incorporate into the clinical trial. I think it's important for patients' experience to be well collected in clinical trials because they're the ones that are going through the experience. And we talk about amplifying the patient voice. Well, we should use the microphone in order to do so. And one way to do that is by asking patients about their symptoms and side effects when they're most likely to be at their worst. And that's within the clinical trial, particularly at the beginning of the clinical trial when they're having side effects with their symptoms. And instead of relying on just monthly assessments, coming into the clinic, wouldn't it be great if we could just ask patients on a weekly basis, for example, via email or text message, about their symptoms and side effects when they're most likely to be bad.
Yeah. And this helps, the result of this helps patients with a more holistic set of information to make decisions with their clinicians about their care treatment plans, or how does it work?
Yeah, it depends on the clinical trial. Some care settings, whether it's routine clinical care or within the clinical trial, that information is viewed real time by healthcare practitioners. And so if they notice that a patient's having a particular symptom or side effect that's severe from their report, then they can say, well, let's have a televisit or come into the clinic, or maybe we need to adjust your dose of your medication. So I think that there's immense potential and value in asking patients about their symptoms and side effects and function at specific moments, and that can have big impacts on the care that patients receive. One of the examples that we use is, when a patient starts a therapy, they may have a vacation planned or an event planned, and so they may be concerned about certain side effects, whether it be a rash or nausea or other types of side effects. And to know that when to expect those types of symptoms and side effects, that can be really important for a patient to sort of understand the trajectory or when the timing of certain symptoms and side effects is.
Yeah. And let's face it, a cancer diagnosis is terrifying and difficult, and this does at least give them a little bit more control or understanding, from what I understand.
Yeah, and we really wanted it to be a point of conversation between a healthcare practitioner and a patient in the office or in the virtual office, but it's something that both can look at and have a discussion further. And so, it's an area of shared decision making, but it's also an area of collaboration for patients and healthcare providers. The current drug trial paradigm is one in which patients should be active participants, and that starts even at the informed consent process. And so when patients are told about a clinical trial or being consented, they should be given appropriate information. And then once they're on a clinical trial, patients are asked to do so much, and that includes a collection of patient-reported outcomes. If we're asking patients about their symptoms and side effects and their function and their quality of life, then it behooves us as a community that information should be used effectively and shared. And so that's really what we're aiming for, is that we use that information, and that starts at good collection of that data. The last thing that we want to do is waste anyone's time, particularly our patients' time.
I think almost everyone would agree that including the patient voice and perspective is important and ethically correct. But it seems that there's a challenge for health organizations, and when it comes to actually rolling it out in practice, there's a range of success levels. Why is that? Why is it so difficult?
I think that there's a lot of practical challenges to rigorous assessment of patient-reported outcomes, but we've really tried to advance the field using things like Project Patient Voice. We have recently released a draft guidance from the Oncology Centre of Excellence specifically about patient-reported outcomes and ways to overcome some of those operational or sort of logistical challenges. We're also spending a lot of time working with international collaborators and other regulatory agencies in order to help standardize the field and help sort of level the field in terms of rigorous assessment of patient-reported outcomes, because you're absolutely correct that clinical trials are a global endeavor, and it's important that everyone's on the same page as far as understanding what this information can be used for and what it should be used for and how it should be optimally collected and then disseminated. However, I think everyone can agree that the patient voice matters, and that it should be incorporated as much as possible into the clinical trial framework, and that it's very important for all of us to listen to patients.
We have some cancer patients in Australia that will be listening to this interview. If you were to speak directly to them, what would you say? How would a clinical trial with patient-reported outcomes be tangibly different for them?
I think that for a patient who is in a clinical trial that has rigorous assessment of patient-reported outcomes, the most important thing I would say is that there would be a good assessment of tolerability. And this is a concept that I think is really important for patients on cancer trials, but then also the data that comes out of the cancer trial. And this is the idea of tolerability. I think we can all agree that the treatment should not be worse than the disease, or the side effects of treatments should not be so intolerable that that patients should have to choose between terrible side effects or a shrinkage of tumor or living longer. So in order to get that information, i.e. tolerability information, it's really important that we ask patients very frequently, especially at the outset of therapy, about their symptoms and side effects. And then other patients should be able to see that data from those patients in the clinical trial. So those that are in a clinical trial should have the opportunity to provide that information to the clinical trial staff. And then that information should then be absorbed by regulatory bodies such as FDA to see not just what the clinician thought about the side effects of therapy, but what did the patient say. And then use that as far as the more along the lines of safety information, but I think tolerability is really the more appropriate term. How tolerable was this treatment? And that really can help regulatory bodies understand the symptoms and side effects that are along with the therapy.
So what have patients been saying about your work? Do they think it's worth it to provide the additional information and give you their time?
Generally, patients have been very supportive of the incorporation of patient-reported outcomes in cancer trials. However, one thing that we've heard loud and clear from patients is the why of why this is being asked of them needs to be very clearly communicated. And from my perspective, it can't just be a paragraph in the informed consent. It needs to be either explained by the clinical trial staff, or informative videos or infographics need to be also provided to patients to explain why this is being asked of them, what this data is going to be used for, and whether they'll be shown these results at the trial completion and things like that.
And I imagine some of that makes sense, because I imagine some of it is quite private and sensitive to collect, very private information about how you're feeling and what's happening with your bodily functions. So I think it makes sense that you'd want to know, what are you going to use this for?
And one extra area that this really comes into play is the redundancy in questions. So a patient may be asked 2 or 3 times or different ways regarding the same symptom, and that can be frustrating for patients to be asked the same question unless they know why. And if it's, well, this survey is used by an HTA body, but this survey is used by this regulatory agency, or this information will be used to alter the clinical care that I receive real time, that may be really helpful for patients to know.
In Australia, like many other countries, we're working to better understand how a new medicine or technology is impacting or benefiting patients. And people are really excited about the potential of real-world outcomes for this, and particularly for rare cancers or rare diseases where there might not be a clinical trial and that might not be feasible. Are there any insights that you can share from your work and understanding of clinical trials with those that are interested in measuring real-world outcomes?
Yeah, so real-world evidence is an area of very huge excitement, and it's a growing field, and it's very similar in the sense to patient-reported outcomes, in the sense that patient-reported outcomes can be also characterized as patient-generated data. It's information that's collected from patients, and it's important data to analyze. And the similarities in that are that this is data that for a very long time had a lot of data missingness and quality issues. But I think in both fields, the data quality is improving. It's very important from our standpoint that this data be thorough and complete in order for us to really, analyze it. And then the second part that I think is very important for real-world evidence is very similar to patient-reported outcomes in that there needs to be a goal or a endpoint that is in mind when collecting this data.
Why is it going to be used?
Why is it going to be, how and why this data is being collected? Because data shouldn't just be collected for the sake of collection. It should be, for a specific purpose, and that purpose should then guide how the data is collected.
Normally, for FDA registration of a new medicine, the focus is on the measurement of safety and efficacy. How do you see patient-reported outcomes feeding into this process? And can this be converted into official measure for clinical trials in the future?
That's a great question, and one that we receive very frequently from companies, trial sponsors, academic groups. In order for patient-reported outcomes to be considered as part of the FDA's benefit risk assessment, so meaning weighing the benefits and risks of a specific therapy
before approval.
Yeah. It needs to be well-collected data. So we need to be able to look at the data and understand that this data was well collected, it's thorough, it's complete, and that we're able to analyze it. Another important feature is that this data in the trial needed to be collected with an endpoint in mind. And that endpoint should have been negotiated or at least agreed upon by the FDA prior to trial being conducted.
So an endpoint would be survival, for example?
So traditional clinical endpoints would be like overall survival, progression-free survival, which relies on some sort of tumor measure, response rate, which again also relies on a tumor measure. And so those are more traditional, efficacy clinical endpoints. When it comes to safety, things like hospitalization, severe adverse event rate, things like that, those are more traditional endpoints. When we're talking about patient-reported outcomes, those are less traditional endpoints, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of interest in incorporating those types of endpoints and that type of data along with the more traditional endpoints. Well, so far right now, I would say that can be complementary information to the more traditional endpoints. So although the basis for approval may be on tumor size and shrinkage or safety endpoints, it's important for the patient perspective to be also included. So patient-generated data or patient-reported outcomes can provide an additional dimension, reinforce much of what the traditional clinical outcomes are. And so what I would say is, as far as oncology studies, I can't speak for other disease areas, is that if a patient-reported outcomes endpoint is being considered, that it needs to be clinically meaningful and relevant to the disease and treatment being studied, and that needs to be sort of pre-specified and included in the clinical trial and agreed upon with the relevant regulatory body. And so what does that look like practically speaking?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, what's an example of that you're allowed to share?
Well, I think that Project Patient Voice has a great example, which is using symptoms. And so there were 28 symptoms in one clinical study that were collected. That certainly wasn't the basis for approval of that drug. That drug was approved based on the clinician-reported safety events and the more traditional tumor outcomes. However, that data was collected, and it's important to share that information. And that information about those 28 symptoms and side effects within one clinical study can serve as an adjunct to the product labeling that's there.
It tells a whole story.
And it tells a different side of the story, a more longitudinal or time-based approach to that story.
You are engaging with the clinical trial community in the US and discussing new technologies and medicines all the time. You have a unique perspective. What gives you hope in terms of improving the cancer care experience for patients in the next 10 years?
What gives me hope is that we've been able to amplify the patient voice and that we're going to continue to amplify the patient voice. And one thing I can say is that our successes up to date and hopefully in the future are a direct result of patient feedback and transparency. And so that's my hope for the next 10 years.
In a previous interview, you and your colleagues noted that the lines between clinical trials and clinical care seem to be blurring. What do you mean by that? What is that?
We definitely understand that clinical trials and routine clinical care should very much align. So the way that patients are treated in clinical trials should very closely resemble how they're treated in clinical care. And those treatments that are approved as a result of a clinical trial should then be used in clinical care in a similar fashion. So to that end, we fully recognize that the sort of rules of the road that we've laid out for patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials will bleed over into routine clinical care, and we hope that patients will certainly benefit from that.
Thank you so much for your time today. We're really grateful. Are there any last thoughts or words that you'd like to share with the cancer community back home?
Well, I thank you so much for this opportunity, and to the Australian cancer community, thank you so much for visiting the FDA and hearing our perspective, and we look forward to further international collaboration along the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.